NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the most important military alliance in the world, has just turned 70. This anniversary comes in the midst of one of the most politically and diplomatically significant crises that it has suffered in its entire history. Today on VisualPolitik, you and I will get to know NATO just a little bit better. Because as 2019 marks the anniversary of NATO, some of the VisualPolitik team traveled to Romania to learn more about how this organization works, and to talk to some of the people in charge, and to witness NATO maneuvers live. So don't tell me that's not a fitting way to celebrate its 70th birthday. And by the way, this video is one of 3 videos in which we're going to get to know this institution a little bit better. Today we're going to see how it works, how it's changed over the years, and the challenges that it faces for the years ahead. So without further ado, let's crack on, shall we? On April 4th, 1949, the Treaty of the North Atlantic was signed, which led to NATO, the most important military alliance of all time, as I already said. Throughout these 70 years, the organization has changed a lot, but most significantly, it's grown. You see, it was originally an agreement between just 12 countries, and today it's got no less than 29 members. The United States, Canada, Turkey, and 26 other European states, including several former members of the Warsaw Pact, which was the former military alliance formed between the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries. Very soon, the Republic of North Macedonia will become the 30th member of the organization. Folks, we're talking about an alliance that represents almost 1 billion people, half of the world's economic power, and most of the world's military spending. It's an organization with joint command structures and troops that train together to be able to respond to a crisis in a coordinated manner. This global defense alliance wields an unprecedented amount of power. So the 29 countries that currently constitute NATO, they've accumulated an annual military spending of more than $1 trillion. That is almost 60% of all the military spending that occurs in all countries everywhere in the world. But hold on for just a moment. Despite having most of the world's military spending power and being bigger and more powerful than ever before, NATO isn't exactly enjoying its golden era. This is something that we've already talked about in several videos here on VisualPolitik. Well, in this and 2 upcoming videos, we're going to explain what's happening and how NATO has evolved over the years and the threats that it faces in its future. But let's start with a bit of history, shall we?
The threat of the Red Army.
The 1940s are about to end. The Second World War ended just 4 years prior. The greatest conflict of all time has left tens of millions of victims of war, not only direct war deaths, but countless additional lives cut short due to disease and the political brutality of totalitarian ideologies. The end of the Second World War, it meant the end of Nazism, but at the same time it also led to the emergence of a new split that would not only divide Europe, but it would divide the world, and it would do it for decades. Yep, that's right, the Cold War had begun. At that time, the European continent, it was devastated, it was economically shattered, and its armies were tattered and demobilized. However, there was an important difference between Eastern and Western Europe. On the one hand, Eastern Europe was under the Soviet Union's control, which maintained more than 5 million soldiers in the region for many years. On the other hand, the presence of the US and UK troops on the continent shrunk very quickly. Between 1945 and 1946, the contingents from these 2 countries deployed in continental Europe dropped from 4.5 million soldiers to less than 900,000. That is to say, by the end of the 40s, the difference in favor of the Soviet troops was 5-1, which, it's a pretty big difference. And not only that, but at the time, communism was an expanding political force. It was spreading to countries all around the globe. And of course, Moscow was very, very certain that it was not going to lose its grip on Europe. Want an example? Well, check this out. In 1947, the Czech Republic accepted the Marshall Plan, but soon after it was forced to renounce due to pressure from Moscow. Only a year later, in 1948, there was a coup that placed the country firmly under communist control. In that same year, the Soviet Union carried out the Berlin blockade, meaning West Berlin had to be supplied by a staggering airlift of 900 daily flights for months on end. Anyway, folks, these were the circumstances that created real fear in Western Europe that the Soviet troops they would advance and occupy new countries such as the Federal Republic of Germany or even the entire continent. It was for precisely this reason that France, the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg swiftly agreed on a mutual defense clause in the Brussels Treaty. This was done in 1948. But fearing that this wasn't enough, these countries quickly turned to the United States, the defense of Europe's free countries. It really had to be ensured. And that's how, finally, on April 4th, 1949, 12 countries, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Denmark, the United Kingdom, Norway, Italy, Iceland, Portugal, Canada, and the United States signed the Treaty of Washington, or the North Atlantic Treaty, that gave birth to NATO.
NATO's first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, summed up the goal of the alliance as, quote, keeping the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Kai Weiss, Research and Outreach Officer of the Austrian Economic Center.
It was precisely in this founding treaty that the famous Article 5 was established.
The parties agreed that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all.
In other words, a very clear agreement, all for one and one for all.
We hope to create a shield against aggression and the fear of aggression, a bulwark which will permit us to get on with the real business of government and society, the business of achieving a fuller and happier life for all our citizens. Harry S. Truman, President of the United States of America.
But it didn't stop there. In 1952, Turkey and Greece joined the alliance, and 3 years later, in 1955, the German Federal Republic joined as well. And it was soon after that that the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc countries, except for Yugoslavia, created their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. This was an alliance that unified the power of all of Europe's socialist countries. We're talking about more than 6 million soldiers, 65,000 tanks, 15,000 combat aircraft, 2,000 warships and nuclear missiles that were distributed among the member states. Europe, it was divided. Two great military alliances confronted each other across a line sketched on a map. Okay, so at this point you might be wondering, well, what has NATO really done? How many missions, how many interventions have they led? How has the alliance changed? Well, let's get into that.
A decisive year.
After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO, an organization created to face the Soviet threat, did not decrease its activity. On the contrary, it slowly began to have a much more active role both inside and outside Europe. Throughout this process, 1999 was a key year. In that year, 3 new countries joined the alliance: Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Remember that these 3 countries had once belonged to the Warsaw Pact and had therefore been seen by NATO for decades as enemy countries.
I do not become from the world of diplomacy. In my previous incarnation, I was a professor of theoretical physics, and I know very well that motion is a relative concept. You move in relation to something. And that which is true for natural sciences is also true for history, I think. And an organization has to move according to the time. It has to move faster than the backdrop. And let's suppose that backdrop is history. When history moves very fast, as is taking place in these years, the organizations that will want to be relevant, they have to move faster than history, faster than the backdrop, if they want to be relevant for the future. I like to say that all of you have made this organization to adapt at a rhythm that probably none of the organizations that were born after the Second World War have done it.
It was the beginning of a process that over the years led NATO to include a large number of Eastern Bloc countries that had been under Soviet control. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Bulgaria, Romania, even Albania. This huge expansion of NATO infuriated the Russian political elite, but gave the organization much more strength while also aiding these newly independent countries to accelerate and consolidate their reforms without fear of reprisals from Russia. But that, folks, it's still not all. 1999 was also the year when NATO carried out its first major offensive. It intervened in former Yugoslavia to stop the ethnic cleansing that the Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic was carrying out against the Kosovo Albanian population. To stop the Serbian government, NATO carried out heavy attacks against political and military targets.
And everybody has to look forward and to try not only to reconstruct physically the country, but also to reconstruct morally the country. That means to reconcile the people.
Folks, NATO's spirit had changed. It was no longer just a defensive organization. At any given moment, there was even speculation of a possible terrestrial invasion of Serbia with NATO troops. And you know what? It's rumored that the then Russian leader Boris Yeltsin was so humiliated and enraged because NATO had dared to include Eastern European countries in its alliance that he even threatened a third world war. If NATO's troops tried to occupy Serbia, Russia would respond.
I have warned NATO, the Americans, and the Germans not to push us into military action. Otherwise, there will certainly be a European war and maybe a world war. Boris Yeltsin, President of Russia.
In a way, years later, in 2008, Moscow's threats became a reality. Georgia's approach by Mikhail Saakashvili to the European Union, and above all to NATO, led the Russian government to unleash a war against this country. The point, folks, is that in the last few years, we've seen NATO take a much more active role. In addition to their continued expansion and the intervention in Serbia, NATO has also intervened in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. And this has led to a huge controversy. The current debate, it goes something like this. Should NATO become an institution that acts where needed to protect its member states, even if they aren't under direct attack? Should it step in if human rights are being seriously violated anywhere in the world? Or should it be limited to being exclusively a defensive alliance, that is, limit itself to act only if a member country is militarily attacked? In short, does NATO make sense today as it was originally intended? And be careful, because the implications of this debate are huge. After all, we're talking about the future of the world and the role of the most important military alliance of all time. We're talking about a debate that is at the forefront, and that in recent times has had the President of the United States, Donald Trump, as its undisputed protagonist. He claims that NATO no longer works, that it doesn't make sense, that it's obsolete.
Number one, NATO is obsolete.
And number two, the people aren't paying their way. It's obsolete, and we pay too much money.
NATO, we're going to have the people that aren't paying, they're going to start paying.
It's obsolete. They were getting ripped in NATO. They don't pay their bills.
They are delinquent.
And this gives rise to another question. So far, NATO has always worked under the leadership of the United States, but could it still work and have a future if the United States stepped down from its leadership position? Even if the US remained a member, could NATO be compatible with a new military leadership structure? This is a topic that we've already talked about here on VisualPolitik on several occasions, but we'll take a more detailed look in a future video. For now, we can say that despite their problems and their mistakes, NATO has certainly been a huge success. I mean, Europe today enjoys an environment of peace, safety, and cooperation between countries. I mean, it's kind of like a good gang of friends. And don't think that this was always the case. Nothing could be further from the truth. For centuries, conflicts and wars between European nations were routine events, and even after the Second World War, the tension between the West and the East had only flourished. In many senses, NATO fulfilled its purpose perfectly, even though its member countries haven't always gotten along and have had their good and bad times, like when France withdrew from the joint military structure, not the alliance, in 1966. Anyway, folks, that is the story of how NATO was born, grew, and changed. In a future video, we're going to examine what the alliance means today and what threats it faces. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did. Don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine, as they always do. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Like it always is, please do consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you next time.